Welcome to Bankruptcy, Through the Looking Glass, with Barry Levine.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Through the Looking Glass with Barry Levine. I'm Matt Skye. Barry is an experienced bankruptcy attorney with nearly 40 years in practice, focusing on helping individuals from all walks of life navigate financial challenges. Join us as we explore his insights on debt relief, bankruptcy, and financial recovery. Barry, thanks for joining us.
Morning. How you doing?
Doing well. So let me ask you, what are some common emotional and psychological challenges individuals face when going through bankruptcy? I imagine it's a lot.
Well, I tell you something. The most common one is that they become like ostriches. They figure they can stick their head in the sand, ignore their mail, ignore the calls, and everything's going to go away. One day they'll wake up and the problems will be gone. That, to me, is really the major issue. And what I try to get across to clients and potential clients is, we're talking about debt. We're talking about money. We're not talking about their health. We're not talking about their family. And the worst thing that can happen is that a creditor can sue them and get a judgment. And it's annoying, but it's really not the end of the world. That's what I try to get across to them is that, first off, when you deal with creditors, their representatives very often think it's their money. And they treat some of these people, listen, I've been doing this, it's actually 43 plus years I've been doing this. And, they treat some of them like they're basically the scum of the earth. For the most part, I'm a very nice guy, but they'd rather not be sitting with me, these clients, and talking about bankruptcy. They wish they had the money to pay these people. And, the real problem is very often the fact that at 26% interest, how are you ever going to pay it off, even if you want to? And the creditors don't give them a break. They pound them, and the stories that some people hear about them calling at work and things like that are very often true. But the major, psychologically, I can't hold their hands. I can't make it go away. The thing I say all too often is it is what it is. The debt is the debt, and you just have to acknowledge it, and life goes on. There really isn't that much you can do.
Barry, how can individuals recognize the early signs of emotional distress related to financial hardship?
Well, things like they're losing sleep over it, they're not eating, or most like anything else, whatever causes people to have, I guess you could say, agita, angst, whatever word you want to use. It's what happens, what it stems from is they stop paying their bills on time. They're making less than the minimum payment. They've lost a job and they have no money and they don't know how to deal with these people. Again, it's not something that, I can be a cynic about it, because the worst thing that's going to happen is that they're going to sue them. And from my perspective, from a potential client's point of view, when a creditor, when it becomes consequential, is so far down the road that it's not even worth being worried about, because, the process is first they nudge you and then they send it to a lawyer who nudges you. Eventually, they decide to sue you. And aside from the nuisance of the lawsuit itself, how does life change? You can still go out to dinner. It's a lawsuit that's pending in some court someplace. And like I said, when it becomes of consequences, especially in Massachusetts, I don't know if other states have it, is that eventually when they get a judgment, in Massachusetts, they can summons you to what they call supplementary process. And at that point, if the client doesn't show up, the court can enter an order, a capias for their arrest, and they could be tooling down the Mass Pike, and the next thing they know, a trooper pulls them over, and they forgot to show up for that hearing in Peabody District Court. They're now in the Framingham State Police Barracks. But that is so far down the road, that it's, like I said, it's not even worth concerning yourself if you pay attention to things. That's the major thing. I've had people, especially in the last couple of weeks, come in here and say, there's a foreclosure scheduled on my house tomorrow. Foreclosure is something that doesn't happen overnight. The bank doesn't wake up and say, "Oh, it's hot out. I'm going to foreclose." You get notices. It's still America. It's and this is the classic person that just ignored all the notices. And now either I've had two of them. Actually, I think the foreclosures took place because they call my office or some other bankruptcy attorney at 10 o'clock. And the foreclosure is scheduled for 11. It's tough to stop it.
That's a lot to deal with. How do you manage people's stress levels throughout these different phases of a bankruptcy process?
Well, I find that between myself and my assistant, Kathy, when they leave us, they sort of, the best thing they say is that they feel relief because we are able to get across to them that it's not the end of the world. I mean, I try to emphasize that Citibank, Bank of America, pick a bank. If they lose money from a bankruptcy to this person, they'll survive. Life will go on. In fact, they'll probably sell the claim to somebody and make money off of it. But there's nothing you can do about it. The time to have been proactive is when you're getting into that situation, when you're starting to use the credit cards. And, the thing is, most of these people nowadays, people who are up against it either because they had medical bills that aren't covered by insurance or they lost a job or their salary was cut in half. It's tough to pay all the creditors.
Yeah, you're right. Very often it's of no fault of their own in that regard.
I have people coming in here, they're beating themselves on the head, on the back, and you can't look at it that way. I mean, it is what it is, and getting out of it is really how you have to look at it. And to me, the filing of bankruptcy is like a good business decision. I mean, otherwise, I've explained to a number of clients and potential clients when all you're doing is paying all your disposable money to your creditors, you're like being an indentured servant. You're a slave to them.
Barry, we all know the importance of support networks. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I don't even really know if there are any support networks. It's not something I get involved with. I look at myself as being their support network, myself and my assistant, Kathy, to get them through the process. I mean, the problem that we very often have is, once we get retained, we tell clients, direct every contact, your creditor calls, the correspondence, if you get litigation, to us. And all too often, like I said, nobody listens, and when they file the bankruptcy, they'll say, "Oh, maybe the creditor calls will stop now." What do you mean? You haven't been referring them to us? And most of them don't. But as to resources, it's a matter of just coping with it.
Right.
And once they get their discharge, then life goes on. They find that they're able to get new credit. If they need to finance a car, they can buy or lease a car or buy a house. They may not get the best interest rate, but they will continue to move forward.
What counseling and financial programs are available for people who are dealing with bankruptcy?
I know that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts offers some things, there's some consumer unions, but I don't really get into that stuff. It's not, I deal with them as they come through the door. And, to me, I look at their situation and we craft a plan to say, this is what we're going to do. And it's more a matter of getting them through the process, which, the thing is, so many of them, when they get through the creditors meeting, the 341 meeting, and it takes all the 5 minutes, and they say, "That's it?" And I say, "Yeah, that's it." It's a lot of anxiety involved for them, but when they get to glean the reality of it, it's really not the worst thing in the world.
So yeah, there's a lot of that doomsday thinking. Can you tell us a little more about how bankruptcies can strain personal relationships and maybe what some of the common issues you see are?
It affects husbands and wives. It affects significant others. I mean, you have situations where all too often one spouse or another has been using the credit cards and maybe the other spouse didn't know about it. But all too often today, it's a it's a household, it's a family problem, it's a husband and wife problem. Debts are theirs. You're dealing often with mortgage arrears, late payments on cars. These are common expenses, not necessarily they use their credit cards to do this, that, and the other thing. Most of the people nowadays, they use their credit cards just to survive, put food on the table, put gas in the car. They don't have enough money to make ends meet or to do anything other than, pay their rent and maybe their utilities.
How do you advise people before they reach bankruptcy? Is there anything they can do? So you're describing is very often maybe out of someone's control.
The alternatives, the debt consolidation companies and, trying to work it out with the creditors themselves, waste of time. I mean, the creditors, their idea, I used to have a letter I used to send out, people never wanted to file a bankruptcy, and this is a long time when I had more hair. And I would send it out to creditors and say, listen, they can file a bankruptcy and pay me X number of dollars, but they're willing to pay you 10 cents on the dollar or something like that, and in the bankruptcy, you're going to get zilch. And the common response from the creditors, well, we'll take 50 or 60 cents on the dollar, and then you have to have the money to pay them in full. And I would say, you don't seem to understand. They can pay me and not pay anybody anything. They didn't care. They'd rather not have to make a decision. And, the debt consolidation companies, the only things, they have very good marketing, we'll deal with this. They have special programs for veterans and special programs for doctors and all this other mishigas. But the bottom line is they rarely settle all your claims. And even if they do, you are going to get 1099s from your creditors, which could result in a taxable event, as the CPAs call it. And most often, the people who come to me after signing up with debt consolidation companies, all they have to show for it is they've paid a fee for X number of months and nothing's happened. And that's basically it. And even then, let's say you have $50,000 worth of debt and they settle 15 grand of it. What have they really accomplished for you? Still have to file a bankruptcy anyway.
So why do you think there's this massive stigma surrounding bankruptcy, filing for bankruptcy?
Because people, it's really a case of they heard, somebody comes to the house, somebody does this, and somebody does that. It's all bullshit. In most cases when you file them are assetless cases. When the notice goes out, the notice tells the creditors that this is an assetless case. Basically, don't call us, we'll call you. The trustees, who are attorneys like myself, they get paid, I think, $65 in an assetless case. They don't spend a lot of time. They're not, the example I always give, I don't know, if you played basketball when you were a kid, oh, you are a kid, and there was the guy who was his ball, and if you didn't let him play, even though he was a terrible ball player, he would take his ball home and you could all go screw yourselves. The trustee isn't going to sell somebody's house just for the hell of it. The only thing that interests them is when their assets and equity that could be liquidated for the benefit of creditors. And that's when they stand to make more money than their $65. But generally, the process itself is not that big a deal.
And let's say someone goes through the process, you have to kind of rebuild. And maybe that's what scares a lot of people. Can you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Well, I tell you something, you'd find, granted, what was it already, 2008 or 2009 when the banks melted down last time, people who went through a bankruptcy and got their discharge were finding it relatively easy to get new credit, refinance mortgages. Once the banks did their thing back then, it started to become a little more difficult. But nowadays, you'll find that post-discharge, creditors very often consider a debtor who's making a decent living a good risk because they can't file bankruptcy again for 8 years and will give them a line of credit. And then I encourage clients to try to develop a relationship with a small bank that could look at them as a person that maybe had a medical emergency, and that's why they filed bankruptcy, or lost a job and that's why they filed bankruptcy, and not necessarily just a credit score. But, it isn't, they will find they'll get mortgages, they'll finance cars. You may not get the best rate because of the bankruptcy, but after a certain point in time, it goes away.
That's an interesting piece of advice. I've never heard that before. So there is a human element if you're able to find smaller banking institutions?
Well, they're tough to find because they really don't exist anymore. The neighborhood, the city bank or something like that, when you deal with a Bank of America or a Citibank, giant conglomerates, you're a FICO score, they don't care what your story is. But a small bank may be able to react to you as a person. They're hard to find. I suggest, though I don't have much, myself don't do business with them, but the credit unions, because, they deal with a certain class of employer, and things like that.
So, Barry, as we wrap up today, if you had one major takeaway for our listeners, what would that be? Filing
a bankruptcy isn't the end of the world. You shouldn't be afraid of it. And it's very often the best way to deal with your debt, because to pay them endlessly, your children's will pay them off, maybe.
It's going to get paid off somehow, I suppose, right, in that sense?
In blood.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thanks so much for tuning into Through the Looking Glass with Barry Levine. For more information or to connect with Barry, visit levineslaw.com. You can also find him on social media. Barry, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to speak with you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.